Praise the Lord, saints and friends, and Happy New Year. This is Elder Adrian Heyman, and we're continuing on a series of lessons on the book of Genesis. Where we last left off, we were going through the genealogy of Cain, and this is significant for three reasons. Number one, at the beginning of it, it said that Cain went out from the presence of the Lord. Now understand that if the Lord is omnipresent, how can Cain ever leave his presence? But the thing is not necessarily the distance, it's the heart. So Cain's leaving was symbolic of him leaving God. Now he had already had disregarded God's advice, and it was actually gentle advice. Told him to look at himself for giving an offering that wasn't acceptable to God. But instead of going back with an offering that was acceptable due to what was in his heart, he let what was in his heart consume him, and he ended up killing Abel. To which he had answered first, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Not realizing that God wasn't asking the question because he didn't know where Abel was. God was asking the question because he wanted Cain to confess. Cain wouldn't do so, but God already knew. Then as he left, we see that the Lord actually gave Cain, even though he drove him away, or he drove him away from his mother and father's house. Just think about it. Adam and Eve had two sons. One was killed by the other, who was then driven off. There must have been a whole slew of emotions. Could have been, of course, definitely sadness, grief, could be anger at Cain. We don't quite really know because it doesn't say, but think of yourself in that position. That God had given you two sons, Cain and Abel, and the one killed the other. Did not have any regard for his brother's life. But God, even in the midst of this, he was merciful to Cain. That he marked him, not just as a fugitive, but marked him in case anyone tried to kill him. In other words, Cain was off limits to anyone that would have tried to fulfill in their own mind God's justice. So you have to understand, God's justice is not our own justice. God can recognize or understand why Cain had to live. And he did that as a request because Cain said, my punishment is too hard to bear. Let's think about it that way. The Lord knew that our punishment was too hard to bear. That's why Christ came, because he could bear what we could not do. In any case, then we went into Cain's genealogy. He said he left from the presence of the Lord, meaning essentially that he, for all intents and purposes, left communicating with God. We never hear about anyone in Cain's line communicating with God ever. Again, possible that one or two people may have been, but what we would normally suggest, and this is the going mindset of many theologians, that this was actually the wicked line. But as he goes through Moses goes through the genealogy as it is, this is the first book of Moses, so either he compiled or he wrote this book. That it talks about how in Cain's line, these are the ones who were the progenitors, or the ones who created either the object or the thing or the occupation. For instance, one of his sons was like the father of such that dwell in tents. He's not saying that all those who dwell in tents came from this particular person, but that he was the first one to use tent as a going from one place to another. And as such, they had cattle, which he had to do because as cattle moved, the tents moved. As they found grass one place, they moved there. So this was probably the beginning of the nomad life. Because remember, Cain built a city, or Cain, with the help of his offspring, built the city. And as he goes through, we also find out that there was one named Lamech. This is not the same Lamech that was in the line of when we will read in a few days, Seth. Wasn't the same one. This one essentially became self-absorbed, self-presumptuous, and totally misconstrued the mark that was set on Cain, saying that essentially if Cain would be avenged sevenfold, then Lamech, for killing someone, if someone tried to kill him, he would be avenged 70 times 7, or 70 and sevenfold, 70 and sevenfold, which means that essentially it was more of a crime in his mind to kill Lamech than it even was for his father. Now, Lamech didn't talk to God. He just got this from his own thing. So what we see is that a rise in what people call hubris, or what others may just call just being conceited. In fact, he was trying to justify his killing a young man. Could be that the young man hurt him in a fight or whatever, but then Lamech overcame this man and killed him. But in any case, you can see the downward trend of Cain's family really manifested in the remarks of Lamech. And then from there, you hear about Lamech no longer. Now, two things could happen. Number one, it didn't really matter. Well, three things could have happened. Number one, Lamech could have essentially been the last of his breed. I don't think most theologians feel that way, but that's one observation. Another observation is that essentially they just weren't that important anymore in the general wickedness of mankind. They just kind of melted into the background. Yeah, if there's anything when I get to the 6th chapter, I may relate some of that to what's going on here. But the idea is that maybe they just did not, again, they melted into the background. There was nothing essentially that was worthy of being said, or any of his sons or descendants. Let it suffice to say that I do not believe that any of Cain's ancestors ended up on the ark. So it might be safe to conclude that Cain's line died with the flood. The other thing, which may be, but again, just something to consider. Sometimes the Jews, when they did genealogies, they didn't include every single person. They skipped some. And again, I'm not saying that in any of the genealogies that are said in the Bible that they're skipping, but they have been known to skip in order to highlight those who were deemed important descendants, so as not to take a whole lot of time and to go through every single person. Now that's possible. It may be the case. It may not be the case. But whatever it is, Cain's genealogy, at least as listed by Moses, stops right there. Now let's go to verse 25. And here we see that mankind is not destroyed, neither is he. He may be, let's say, delayed for a little bit, but God talks about the seed of the woman, which means there has to be someone in the genealogy of the one to whom God's seed will come through. It wasn't going to come through Cain, and of course it definitely wasn't going to come through Abel. But it does say, and Adam knew his wife again. And whenever it talks about someone knowing someone, That's a saying that they had sexual relations. In other words, knowing means you are intimately knowing someone in the most intimate of situations that man can enter into in terms of physically. So Adam knew his wife again, and of course Eve conceived, and she bare a son. Now remember, Eve, the woman, was to multiply their conception. If Adam and Eve were not to have eaten of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, it could have been that they would have still had children, but the children would have been maybe spaced apart at a much longer period of time. As it is, it was very important that Eve had children at regular times because, number one, that would allow the population of the earth to grow so as to expand around the earth. And number two, it was at least to replace those who have died, because the key here is this: death had entered the world. Let's go again with verse number 25 of chapter number 4 of Genesis. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son and called his name Seth. And I was looking at that particular name and looking in Strong's Concordance, and it seems as if that the name means somewhat like replacement, which is a very apt condition or apt description of the situation. For God, said she, have appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. Now, I want you to think about this too. Seth was to be a replacement. And a replacement for who? A replacement for Abel, not for Cain. It looks like Cain could have been, because of the murder of his brother, that his father and at Cain's father and mother, along with the Lord himself, banished him from their house, from being in that area, from taking part of anything, because essentially, remember, there was only, at that particular time, 4 souls living in the world. Cain took care of one of them. And so therefore, the other one was ended up being banished. But it was pretty interesting that the narrative says that Seth was the one who replaced Abel. Seth did not replace Cain or both of them. He replaced Abel, because Abel was the righteous one, the one who essentially had the righteous offering, possibly had the right attitude all along. That should show you another thing. Just because you're a good person does not mean that good things will necessarily happen to you. Remember, Abel, who was a good person, at least as far as a good person can be, he was slain by Cain, who had selfish desires, and he was envious of what Abel had. And because of that, that essentially was transferred to all of his descendants. So possibly even before Cain slew Abel, Adam and Eve already understood that Abel was the one who had the right temperament. Cain, possibly not as much. People read over this very quickly, but to understand this, you may think about that. That essentially who God appoints. God will appoint someone who will always, see, God's program will never falter. Sister Green, praise the Lord, I see you. God's program will never falter. But just know that just because you're a good person does not mean that good things will happen to you. Why? Because this is an evil world. Life is not fair. And I think once we get past that point, then we begin to understand what things happen. That there are things that happen in this world that does not seem to make any sense if we're talking about righteousness. Because the world is not built on righteousness. If it was, Abel wouldn't have been slain by his brother, and his blood would not have been crying out from the ground as a witness against Cain. But because of this, we know even in the beginning that the good does not always receive their just reward, at least on earth. I'm sure Abel, especially with the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, I'm sure Abel is one of those that's in the presence of God. Cain possibly not so much, in terms of their souls, I mean. But as one thing to really think about, that Seth replaced Abel. He did not replace Cain. Which should let you figure that maybe Cain, once he did his action, that his father and mother may have banished him themselves as well as God. Then verse 26 comes in. And lo, Seth, to him also there was born a son, and he called his name Enos. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. Now, if you read this and you see what happens, that when Seth bears Enos, and then it says, then men begin to call upon the name of the Lord, that maybe that means that the people are coming or getting closer and closer to God. That's one interpretation of it. But if you think about it, it may have been that that's what Seth's parents told them to do. Remember, Adam and Eve were the ones who really had that fellowship with God before their downfall. So they understood. And as long as they lived, they could tell the story as to how the Garden of Eden was and how paradise was and what they did to, unfortunately, disqualify themselves from being in that paradise. And Adam, as you will see, have lived a long time. So he had plenty of time to tell Seth's descendants as to what took place and train them in that way. And by the time that Enos was born, it could have been also that after Seth, Adam and Eve began producing other children. And so it wasn't just Seth that heard about it, because remember it says men. That means it was actually ended up being quite a few. And because of that, there may have been essentially a growth of people. And as they began to, again, separate and to spread over the earth, and they left their father and their mother to make their own way in the world, that they began to be, they wanted to be recognized, or they wanted to be called by the name of God, that they belong to God. And that does not mean that they were saved, doesn't mean that they were doing things that they were supposed to. It's okay. That doesn't mean that they were doing things that they were supposed to, but then maybe at that particular time they begin to have a system with how to sacrifice to God, how to make sacrifices, and how to pray and petition the Lord. In any case, essentially, this particular phrase is quite interesting, that essentially when Enos was born of Seth, that essentially then men began to call upon that name. Now, what name is that? If you read here, you see that in the King James Version, the Lord is in capital letters. So essentially, meaning that it's Yahweh. Maybe they called him by that name. Possibly that the name of the Lord was always there, Because remember how Abraham, when he was about to sacrifice his son, and he called the name of the place Jehovah Jireh, which means that essentially the name of the Lord was already there. But by the time they got into slavery, they forgot the name of the Lord. So sometimes, again, that's a lesson in itself. That's a lesson. I'm not going to go down there. But that's a lesson in itself, that if we keep messing with the beggarly elements of this world, and we end up focusing instead on our own desires and what we like to do here on earth, then we actually will begin to forget the intimacy that's associated with the name of Jesus. So we can draw parallels between what's happening in the days of the patriarchs and days of the early Israelites and even today. But in this particular case, whereas you can now see that the genealogy that starts after Cain, that begins with Seth, will become much more full. It's not as sparse. And it also brings to you a mention that whereas Cain left the presence of the Lord and went downhill from there, Seth, when he bore Enos, or when his wife bore Enos, that essentially men begin to call upon that name. They begin to call upon the name of the Lord. They begin to want to be associated with that name. Now, does that mean everyone did? No. You will see that the world became very wicked. So obviously that was lost. But even in that particular instance, we see that there's an effort. There's an effort by men to at least have some type of relationship with God. But you see how sin has already messed up the world. They left a pristine garden. Disobedience took them out the garden. Feelings of inadequacy led to feelings of hurt, led to feelings of anger, led to feelings of jealousy and envy, which led to murder and banishment. And it all went downhill from there, from that side. Seth's side, it was left as a little bit of a hope that maybe men aren't falling back or falling down as much as Cain's side. And it never said that Seth left the presence of his mother and father. Could be that maybe he did go, but it had to be with his mother and father's blessing. And I'm sure that Cain related the stories of what took place in the years before the fall of man, that Adam told Seth these stories, and he passed it on to his son, and passed it on to his son, and so on and so on. Cain and Abel never got the chance to do that to their descendants. Of course, Abel had no descendants. Cain left the presence of the Lord, so he didn't have any way of communicating that story to his sons and daughters. So you see already there's a split. There's a split between what would eventually be called the sons of God. Because remember, they call upon the name of the Lord, the sons of God, versus, or those that came from God, versus the daughters of men and their depravity and their wickedness and their iniquities. It's already started here. How worse does it get? We'll talk about that next time. God bless you. May he keep you. I love you all. Keep studying the Word of God. In Jesus' name.